You can't expect everybody to be a superhero. Not everybody's going to be the first person in line at every march. Not everyone's going to get involved on every single issue, but you can hope to bring people along from where they are at the moment to somewhere better, in the future.
Welcome to the Race to Social Justice, a podcast that explores the myriad racial and social challenges facing the modern world, with your hosts, Kiva White and John Kepner. Thank you for being part of the courageous conversation, because when it comes to combating social injustices in America, it is not about being confrontational. It is about being conversational.
All right, so good afternoon, John.
Good afternoon, Kiva.
Welcome, everyone, to our Race to Social Justice podcast series. I am Kiva White, the black guy, as you can see.
And I'm John Kepner. I'm the white guy. And Kiva and I share a love of the letter K. K for Kiva, K for Kepner, but more importantly, K for knowledge, what we try to impart during our podcasts.
Yes,
and that you call the K factor, right?
Yes, absolutely. The K factor, the knowledge factor. And we get a lot of knowledge from our guests here each and every time we do these podcasts. And they're really intended to promote social and racial justice and equity through sometimes often honest and difficult dialogue, which me and John have coined as courageous conversations. And over the years, John and I have found that our discussions with each other have deepened our respective understandings of racism and a wide range of other forms of social inequity in our society and our personal responsibilities to kind of right-size that. This led us to invite guests to share their honest experience and learnings. And then we hope these conversations will really enlighten our listeners and even our viewers and even our guests as we all continue on this journey towards social justice. So we're glad to be here again for another episode. And with that, John, who do we have today as our guest?
Well, I'm really delighted to introduce everybody to Andrew Maraniss. Andrew is the Special Projects Coordinator for the Athletic Department at Vanderbilt University. And you might be wondering, well, what does that have to do with racial and social justice? Well, you'll see in a minute. Andrew's a 92 graduate of Vanderbilt, majored in American history. He's had some years as the media relations person for the athletic department, had a stint with Major League Baseball, with the Tampa Bay, then the Devil Rays, I guess they were, right?
That's right. They were back then.
Right. And has had experience in a PR firm, but for the past several years, he's been back at Vanderbilt. And Andrew has written two books that are directly important to our discussion of racial and social justice, one of which we're going to dive into pretty deeply today, I hope, called Strong Inside, Perry Wallace and the Collision of Race and Sports in the South. But the other one is also equally compelling, I believe, and on my reading list, and that and I would say it's about baseball. So I gave a real deference to my colleague Kiva, who's a basketball guy, by picking Perry Wallace story to talk about today. But he also wrote Singled Out, which is a story of Glenn Burke, who was the inventor of the high five. But that's not what the story is about. The story is about him being the first gay, first man to come out as a gay in Major League Baseball at the Dodgers. So by way of further introduction, this is particularly interesting to me for a number of reasons today. One is that I was introduced to Andrew by my son, Tyler, who's also a sports journalist, and they both share the experience of having been to Vanderbilt, and both were Fred Russell Grantland Rice scholars, which was very important to both of their careers. And maybe you could talk a little bit about that, Andrew. Secondly, the story that Andrew tells about Perry Wallace takes place in the middle of the 60s, the heart of the 60s. I graduated from college in 1968, right in the middle of this story. So I experienced in the North some of the same things, and it just was like a visit back with more knowledge about some things that were going on that I hadn't known about. And I think for folks listening who are in that age range, you're going to find it special. And then I love sports, but this is a book that's far deeper than sports. It covers what was happening in the South and racial relations and across the country. It's a story about Vanderbilt and its coming of age as the Harvard of the South. It's a story about leadership. It has so many implications to it, and of course, the story about this unbelievable athlete is so compelling. And then finally, the scholarship behind it. Andrew took 8 years, 4 years to research this book. There are 25 pages of notes in the back to evidence that, and then 4 years to write it. So, and it paid off, Andrew. So, thanks for joining us. Sorry for that long introduction, but I thought it was necessary. And let me just start off by asking you to, though we do this with almost all of our guests, take us back to growing up. What's the story about how you got to be interested in this subject of race relations, starting with your boyhood?
Yeah, well, thank you, John. Thank you, Kiva. This is really a pleasure to be with you. And thank you for mentioning your son, Tyler. Also, I'm a big fan of his. And when you were mentioning all the K's at the beginning, I was thinking of his book with the
right. There's
title.
Another K. Good point.
Yeah. And so my way into being interested in race really starts with my interest in sports. And so I was born in Wisconsin, Madison, Wisconsin. My dad was a big baseball fan. He still is. My grandfather was a huge Milwaukee Braves and, fan himself. And so I was introduced to sort of baseball at an early age. I started collecting cards when I was 5 years old. I know Tyler used to write his own, newspaper when he was a kid. I had a sports magazine that I started when I was 13 years old.
All right.
We moved to Texas when I was in high school. And as you mentioned, came to Vandy on the Grantland Rice Scholarship. There was just a poster on the wall of my high school, Austin High, that was advertising that scholarship. And I was the sports editor and played baseball at my high school. And that's how I came to Vanderbilt. And my sophomore year, there was an article in the newspaper about this man, Perry Wallace, being invited back to campus for the first time in almost 20 years since he had graduated. And Perry, I didn't know anything about him at the time, but, he was the Jackie Robinson figure of the SEC. He was the first Black basketball player at Vanderbilt, but the first Black athlete in the entire conference that had played a whole 4-year career in any sport. I was, as you mentioned, majoring in history. I was taking a Black history class. Race had always been something that my family had talked about. My grandfather served in World War II, white, obviously, but he was with an all-Black unit in the Pacific. And he came back from World War II with a tremendous admiration for the guys that he had served in World War II with, and I think that really influenced the rest of his life. My grandparents went to see Jackie Robinson play at Wrigley Field. They drove from Detroit to Chicago, to see that history made. Grandfather was a newspaper editor in Wisconsin and hired the first Black reporters at this newspaper, and so that was something that was really important to him, was passed along to my father, and then passed along to me as well. So when I was at this school in the South, in the SEC, I don't think my parents were too excited that I was going to an SEC school based on what they knew about the South. And I don't consider Nashville the deep South, but it's certainly close. And learned about Perry Wallace. That was something that really grabbed my attention. I was like, wait a minute, we had this pioneer at my school, let me learn more about that. And so I wanted to write a paper about him for this Black history course that I was taking, and was concerned that my professor would say, no, we don't write about athletes or basketball in college. That's not serious enough academics. But thankfully, Dr. Yolette Jones said, great, if that's what you want to do, go for it. And so I called Perry from my dorm and interviewed him for 2 hours about his experience desegregating SEC basketball. And really at that point, as a 19-year-old, I was more interested in the athletic side of it. Like, what was it like to go down to Ole Miss and play a basketball game? And how were you treated by the fans and your teammates? it wasn't until I started working on the book about Perry 17 years later that I was mature enough or had gotten a little bit smarter and understood that there was a lot more to this than just a basketball story, and that his story really was interesting if you place it within the context of the civil rights movement, and what was it like to be a Black kid in Nashville in the 50s and 60s, told that, we don't want you on this campus, stay away. You're not, Vanderbilt didn't have any Black students at all until Perry was 16 years old, and then all of a sudden, because you're a great basketball player and you're a great student, this school that says they don't want anything to do with you is recruiting you, and you're going to have to travel to Alabama a few years after George Wallace is standing in the schoolhouse door, and travel to Mississippi a few years after James Meredith and the riots that accompanied his admission to Ole Miss. And you're going to be down there as the only Black person in the entire gym playing in these basketball games. And what does that take out of a pioneer, physically and mentally? And so diving into the full story of the history and the surrounding context, and looking at it from Perry's perspective, I was so fortunate to have, like you say, 8 years to work on this book. At times that felt like forever, and that I wasn't getting the job done. I had a lot of guilt about spending so much time on the book, but what it allowed me to do is to get to know Perry that much better. He's not alive now, but he was the entire time I was working on the book and when the book came out. And so I had a chance to go back to him many, many times to do more interviews, came down to Nashville. We drove around town, and I got to see Nashville of the 1960s, through his eyes. And so I know this is a roundabout way of answering your question, but it really, my initial interest came purely by loving sports and identifying a sports figure that had a lot more to him and could teach a lot about race and racism. And that's what inspired me to stay interested and to continue on that path today.
So when you called him as a reporter for the Hustler,
Vanderbilt Hustler, student newspaper,
right? Student newspaper,
not the other one.
Gotta get that.
Yeah. Make sure we we clarify that.
Right.
Thank you.
He was he a law professor by that time?
Yes, at that time he was a law professor at the University of Baltimore. He was the first Black tenured law professor there. He later became a professor at American University Law School, which is where he was for 20 plus years. This gives me a chance to tell a Philly story with you Philadelphia guys. So when Perry graduated from Vanderbilt, he was drafted by the 76ers. Wow. And the coach at that time was Dr. Jack Ramsey. Mm-hmm. And Perry and Coach Ramsey got along great, both, really smart guys with a lot of interest beyond basketball. There was a really veteran laden team in the early 70s for the Sixers. So Perry didn't make the team, but Dr. Jack wanted to keep him around. And so he helped him land a roster spot on the Wilmington Blue Bombers, nearby Wilmington, Delaware.
Sure. Yeah.
And during the season, this type of guy Perry Wallace was, so much more than just an athlete. He was teaching high school math at Bartram High School in Philadelphia at the same time that he was trying to make it as a semi-pro basketball player. And he also served as a volunteer assistant coach on the basketball team at Bartram. And there was a great player on the team that Perry identified that he thought really had a future in basketball, whose name was Joe Bryant and Jelly Bean Bryant. So Perry coached Kobe's dad when Kobe's dad was in high school.
How about
Look at that.
That's cool. So I'd like you to talk about the distinguishing athletic talent that Perry developed as a teenager, his leaping ability and the dunking, and then talk about the reaction of the SEC going into his sophomore year when he was now going to be on the varsity. Because I think it's a really interesting contrast about, it's the story of the dunk and it's one of the themes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And Perry would call the dunk his freedom song, and that was his way of expressing freedom and artistry, improvisation in a culture that was trying to restrict him and other Black people in any way possible. So the dunk meant a lot more to him than just a move on a basketball court. But yeah, he worked on his legs, and a lot of people will dismiss an athletic player as like they were born with it, but Perry worked really hard physically to develop the ability to dunk. And by the time he was a junior and senior in high school, he was the best dunker and most acrobatic dunker on a team where every single player on the Pearl High basketball team could dunk, even the shortest point guard.
And that was their routine. That was their pregame routine. You could just vision. Folks, I hope you read this book because Andrew takes you there. You could just see their pregame warm-ups.
I loved writing about that. Yeah, these Pearl High Tigers would come out and they would play Sweet Georgia Brown in their little gym, and they'd all come out and just one after another dunk it, and save Perry for the last with the most dramatic dunk. His team was a great team. It wasn't like they just dunked. They won the state championship his sophomore year and his junior year and his senior year. And they went undefeated his senior year, which was the first time in Tennessee that black schools and white schools actually played against each other. They had separate tournaments prior to that. And so Perry was known as a great leaper. He could pull a quarter off the top of the backboard type of leaper. Back in those days in college basketball, they had freshman teams and varsity teams. It wasn't one and done. You couldn't even play varsity as a freshman. And so Perry's freshman year, there's a game at Kentucky. And this would have been the year after Kentucky lost to Texas Western in the famous Glory Road National Championship game. And on that Texas Western team, there was a player named David Big Daddy Lattin, who early in that championship game had dunked over Pat Riley. And that set Adolph Rupp, the Kentucky coach, off, this embarrassing dunk over Pat Riley.
The Lakers Pat Riley?
What's
the
that?
The Lakers Pat Riley?
Yeah, he played for Adolph Rupp. It's amazing to me that, just to get off subject here, the history of basketball can be reduced to so few connections that you had Adolph Rupp, who played at Kansas, where James Naismith, the inventor of basketball, had been the head coach. Adolph Rupp then coaches Pat Riley, who brings LeBron James to the Miami Heat. So you go from Naismith to LeBron James in two people. Anyway, so Big Daddy Lattin, who had dunked it over Pat Riley, had started his college career in Nashville very briefly at Tennessee State, where Perry Wallace would play in pickup games with him when Perry was in high school. And Perry develops a dunk similar in style to David Lattin. So Perry's freshman year, he plays against Kentucky. This is the year after the Glory Road game. Vandy goes up to Kentucky, and Perry is all of a sudden, he's the second coming of David Lattin. He dunks it over Dan Issel. And he said that as he ran down the court, he looked and he saw this old man going crazy on the sideline. And it was Adolph Rupp, who, again, did not appreciate being dunked on, especially by a black player. And so Adolph Rupp was very influential in the college basketball rules committee. He had been the head of the rules committee. And so the next off season, before Perry Wallace is about to join the Vanderbilt varsity team and is going to play 2 games a year against the Kentucky varsity, the slam dunk is outlawed in college basketball. And at the time, it was known as the Alcindor rule, as if it was entirely aimed at Lou Alcindor, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and UCLA, and the way that he was changing the game. But, I make the case in the book that Kentucky wasn't going to be playing UCLA unless they met in the NCAA tournament, but they were going to be playing Perry a couple times a year. And so I think that Adolph Rupp was thinking of Perry Wallace when he outlawed the slam dunk. But of course, it was bigger than that too. And it was really a reaction among white power structure in the game to limit the contributions of these black players who were changing the way that basketball was being played at that time. And Perry was symbolic of that.
From Perry's standpoint, it was his trademark. I mean, it was meant a lot to him. And you gave the broader context of the team and the Pearl High School and so forth. Kiva, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, I think what you just mentioned, Andrew, here about the power structure and those in power, how the policies and the rules can be symbolic of the continued oppression, even on the court, even in the game of sports, even in sports play, how that can tend to restrict and hinder the skill set and the talents of African American athletes. There's a book out called The $40 Million Slave. I'm not sure you're familiar, but if you read
William Roden. Yeah.
Correct. Yep. Yeah. So I've read that, and it really talks about, and I know we won't have time to discuss it here, but it just talks about even in the, how the $40 million slave is the African American talent is exhausted until pretty much that player is not worth anything anymore. And then what you're talking about is how the other side of the coin is that how the rules was restricting that player from showing all of the talents that they have. Mm-hmm. So you have, to have this dichotomous nature of those in power is, do you want the person, it's not until that person's talent is able to produce some form of wealth for the team. And then we will release, him or her, so to speak, to be able to give it their best in all. And how these, like the dunk rule for me was really like a way, and when I read that, it was really like a way of just keeping, quote unquote, Perry Wallace in his place in society back in that time, not to let him to excel to his full potential.
Absolutely. I was thinking of $40 million slaves as before you mentioned it too. It's exactly. And Roden writes about how, sports are positioned as this level playing field, but how many times has the playing field been tilted against Black athletes? Banning the slam dunk is a prime example of that. And to kind of close the loop on the dunk and Perry, his final game as a senior in 1970 is a game against Mississippi State, which is an opponent that means a lot to Perry because of how poorly he was treated in his first time visiting Starkville, Mississippi. But this is a home game against Mississippi State. And he decides before the game that he's going to dunk it, even though by this point, the dunk is against the rules in college basketball. Yep. And so the last basket of his college career is an illegal slam dunk.
Yeah.
And he told me that growing up in segregated Nashville, there had been these racist laws. They were laws, but they were unjust laws. And in college basketball during his career, there was this rule, but it was an unjust rule, and so he was making good trouble, you could say, like John Lewis would say.
John Lewis, that's right.
And dunking the ball. And
good trouble, right.
The refs should have waved it off, there should have been a technical foul, but they let it go.
They counted it, that's right.
Perry was proud that was his form of protest on the way out, was this final slam dunk.
Yeah. That's an interesting comment about the refs letting it count. Mm-hmm. Given the fact that not too long ago, a couple of days ago, I just read about his first visit to as a sophomore, Mississippi, and other instances where he was blatantly fouled and injured in that, severely injured. He had to leave and come back, and the refs didn't call.
No calls. Yeah.
No calls.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. No. You're right. It was unusual in terms of his treatment by the refs that they let it go in that last game. Would you want me to tell the Ole Miss story?
Sure. Yeah. It's a great story.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So Perry's freshman year, again on the freshman team, University of Mississippi canceled its games against Vanderbilt rather than play against a team with a Black player. And so it's not until his sophomore year that he becomes the first Black player to play a game at Oxford against Ole Miss. And in the first half of the game, he takes an intentional elbow to the face, and he's bleeding. His nose is bleeding. He's dizzy. He can't see out of one of his eyes. Referees don't even call a foul. Don't even whistle a stop to the game. And so it's not until the first dead ball that the student manager who I interviewed was able to come out onto the court to help Perry. And he said that he was walking him across the court to the locker room to get a bag of ice. And as they walked across the court, the Mississippi crowd stood and cheered the fact that Perry was injured. And as they got close to the tunnel, to the door to lead to the locker room, they both felt this wetness on their back, and they were getting Cokes dumped on them and being spit on. But Perry actually had a really interesting thing to say about this moment in his career. He said that the most difficult and disheartening thing was actually not what I just described, but what happened at halftime. And he said he sat on a training table in the locker room with this bag of ice, and there's a clock in the locker room that lets the team know when it's time to go back on the court. to start the second half. And as that clock hit zero, everybody associated with his team ran back on the court, all the players, the coaches, the managers, the trainer, and they left Perry back in there by himself. And he knew that he was going to have to walk back into this hostile environment alone. And that it really showed that there was a lack of empathy and understanding by all those who supposedly were his team, and that if they had that bit of empathy, they would have walked with him and shown the crowd that they had their teammates back. Yeah. And it was at that moment that he realized that this pioneering experiment was a solitary experience for him. And he talks about the different ways that we can all treat each other. And he said, you can be treated well by other people, you can be treated poorly by other people, or you could not be treated at all. He said that applies to any one of us every day of our lives. And people would assume that being treated poorly was the most difficult part of his experience, the way those Mississippi fans treated him. But he said, actually, the most difficult part was the idea of not being treated at all. Mm. And so you could see that his teammates, leaving him in the locker room is an example of that, or the way that he felt on his own campus quite a bit, where he felt very isolated and lonely and not included in the social life of the university. And that was long 4 years of isolation that he said was the most difficult part of his experience.
And I think the title of your book is just so appropriate, Strong Inside, because as I listen to you, Andrew, talk about some of his experiences, as a social worker, one of the things I try to connect is the traumatic experiences that racism creates, and within the individual. And just hearing that, I hear a couple of things. I hear abandonment, I hear rejection, I hear isolation, and all of those things that he experienced as a result of, the times that he was living in the racism that existed during that time. And despite all of that, he was still able to persevere. And this really speaks to that whole resiliency threshold that I think, social injustices and racism has, served as a byproduct for those who are able to endure these type of behaviors and atrocities in our society and still make it to be successful. We have to really look at their ability to, overcome these traumatic experiences. Because I couldn't imagine. I've experienced discrimination, but not to that degree. And I'm not sure how I would have responded to that type of behavior by my teammates, by those who were supposed to, like you said, have my back, to just walk out and leave me, as we would say when I was growing up, leave me hanging, so to speak.
Hanging, right.
Yeah, to kind of weather, and, to no solidarity was shown, yet he was still able to persevere. So I think I just wanted to comment on that, to speak to your title about the book being titled Being Strong Inside, because in my opinion, it takes a lot of strength to be able to endure. Well,
thank you. Yeah. And it, just sort of that underlying trauma that you mentioned, and people not really acknowledging that, and him being expected to produce on the court like anyone else, right? Or produce in the classroom as if none of that was happening. And there's an intended double meaning with the title too. He was a center, he was a strong inside player as well. Yeah. And one thing I've been picking up lately and listening to different speakers is this, not necessarily or understanding what when you say someone is strong, what that means, and not letting others off the hook, who are making someone have to be strong. He shouldn't have had to have been that strong, all the time. But Perry was an incredibly strong person. He always persevered. He was really proud that this experience didn't really ruin him. He was proud that he continued with his education and went to Columbia University Law School and became an attorney for the Justice Department and professor, when he said there was a very fine line between making it and not making it, out of that experience, mentally, even living. The first Black player at Auburn University, that was the only Black player that Perry played against his whole career, was named Henry Harris. There's a great book about him called Remember Henry Harris. And Harris died by suicide a few years after leaving Auburn. And I think Perry could understand the connections there and how that could have easily been him. Mm-hmm. And so that strength, I think it came from Perry's his family. He came from a really strong family, his parents and his sisters. I think it came from his understanding of history. He was someone that read a lot, and he knew what Jackie Robinson's experience had been like. He read Walter White, the NAACP president, his sort of accounts of life in the South before Perry came along. Came from his faith. His mom would tell him to put on the full armor of God, and that's what will protect you in certain situations. It also came from his, he understood that there are a lot of people counting on him to succeed. He did not want to let them down, but he also understood there are a lot of people that wanted him to fail, and he didn't want to satisfy those people either. So many forces, that were healthy, and maybe some that weren't healthy, but that were keeping Perry going, that allowed him to remain strong in all these situations.
Wow.
Yeah. I want to pick up on you've given some good examples of how both blatantly and outwardly and then subtly white people impacted him because of their racism. But and a stark example. So here's a guy who's an intellect. He was, the top of his class, became a law professor he was a really smart, intellectually oriented guy. His first encounter with his English teacher. Here's a guy who's coming to Vanderbilt largely because of its not just because of basketball, but part of his decision was because of the excellence that he expected, and the first encounter with that English teacher. Could you talk about that? But also then some encounters with white people who actually did empathize and help him, because there's some good examples of that too. There's two sides to this coin.
Yeah. So, and I'll tell a church story too that relates. It's very similar to the English class story. So when Perry was recruited to Vanderbilt, the player that showed him around was named Clyde Lee, who was a white player who went on to play in the NBA for 10 years. And he was from Nashville, just like Perry, had grown up in the Church of Christ, just like Perry, but different churches, segregated churches. When Clyde Lee showed Perry around the campus, he said, "Here's the University Church of Christ. It's right across the street from school. This is where you should go when you arrive here." And it was a white church, but Perry gave it a shot. He said, "This is what pioneering was all about. It was doing these new things." And so he arrived on campus a month before school started to get acclimated, and he starts going to this church. And for the first 3 Sundays, he goes and he sits in the back, and he's left alone or ignored, depending how you want to look at it. And the 4th week that he walks in, some older members of the church pull him aside and they say, "Perry, you can't keep coming here. There's members of the church that say they'll write the church out of their wills if we, quote unquote, allow you to keep coming to our church, and you have to leave right now." And so this place that has recruited him before his first day of class, he's already been kicked out of church, of all places. Then, as you mentioned, his English class, and I believe this specific anecdote actually happened to his friend Walter Murray, who had been the salutatorian at Pearl High School with Perry. Yeah. But could have just as easily happened to Perry, is that the professor greeted him by saying, "So I see they've let the N words in after all." And that's a professor directing that comment to a student on the first day of class. Other Black students that I interviewed for the book talked about how they would walk into a classroom and look around and notice that none of their white classmates would sit in the same row with them, or even in the row behind them. Perry talked about, he was an engineering student. He talked about some of the science classes he took where you would walk in and take a seat at a stool, and whoever sat next to you would be your lab partner for that day. And, what if you're the first student to walk in and you're seated there and you watch all the other students walk in the classroom and nobody chooses to sit next to you? And so those were sort of the daily, in some cases, I wouldn't exactly call them microaggressions. They're a little bigger than that, but it wasn't someone, in your face necessarily like the English teacher was, but just everyday existence on the campus. And again, this sense of isolation and and loneliness that he felt in the classroom, in his dormitory. And he was really as much of a pioneer just existing on the campus as he was as a basketball player.
And yet he still managed to go to Columbia University and become a law professor. So
yeah.
I think if we can just imagine, if we was to able to take a huge vacuum and just suck all of that segregation, all of that discrimination, all of that oppression out of this young man's life, how much further he could have went in society. And I think, these societal barriers that tends to attempt to derail the success. And since we're talking about Christian, that God has already ordained for his life, it's not going to, if God has already ordained him to be successful, it's going to happen. And he talks about how segregation actually helped him by going to Pearl High School. As a result of segregation, it allowed him to go to an all-Black school where there was all-Black teachers. Mm-hmm. And I shared this with John. That was a blessing for him because, in my experience, I didn't see a teacher that looked like me until I was in college, almost in high school and college. For him, he was around, educators that looked like him, that cared about him. So I think that whole cultivation of who he was from that standpoint and being educated from people who looked like him, really, in addition to his parents and the values that his parents instilled in him, really built the foundation for him to become an overcomer. And I just think, all the things that he was faced with, if we can just remove all those barriers, one can only just imagine he probably more than just dunking at age 12, just how much further he would have been able to excel in society if those barriers were not non-existing.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point about Pearl High School, the assumption that a desegregated school would automatically be a better environment, right? Like that, yeah. It wasn't the case. So an irony of segregation is that Perry was able to go to this school that was a great school with professors, like you say, who were invested in his success, and, because of segregation, what Perry would say is that the most talented, smartest African-American adults in town were teachers at Pearl High School, because they were limited in their job opportunities elsewhere. But they were pouring themselves into this generation of students like Perry. And Perry said that as a kid coming along in the mid to late 60s, he felt the country changing in certain ways. He felt for the better, that he watched the lunch counter sit-ins take place in Nashville. He started high school a week after MLK's I Have a Dream speech. He's in high school for the passage of the Voting Rights and the Civil Rights Act. And so he said he felt like there were opportunities coming, and that these teachers who had been denied opportunities themselves were giving of themselves to prepare Perry and his classmates for what was coming next, And then he arrives at Vanderbilt, and there was this racist assumption that because he had come from an all-Black high school, that it must not have been a very good school,
Yeah.
And in fact, the opposite was true. And he was really well prepared academically for Vanderbilt, and he enjoyed proving people wrong.
Yeah. I was talking with John about that, and how, I thought I always like to make similarities and look into, so how Pearl High School may have been, I'm not sure, it may have been the foundation for HBCUs, like historically Black community colleges and universities, how, the comparison to HBCUs, to Ivy League schools. Like if you're coming from an HBCU, you may not be as, but there's a lot of successful people of color that came out of HBCUs that are doing great things in this country. So your comment about, the thought that just because he came from an all-Black high school, he may not be able to compete at Vanderbilt was a misnomer.
Absolutely. And Nashville had a strong HBCU community also, with Fisk University and Tennessee State University, which is where a lot of his teachers had gone to college. It's where his sisters had gone. And in fact, his sister, Jessie, was really hoping that he would go to school at an HBCU. She didn't want him to have to deal with all the stuff that came along with, integrating a basketball team in a whole basketball conference.
I wanted to go back to your comment about his parents and their influence. And I have a question about your parent, your father. And you talked about it as being a baseball fan. For those of you who don't haven't figured it out, Andrew's father is also a noted author. And I just loved his book about Vince Lombardi, but Tyler pestered me to read his book about Roberto Clemente. And what I'm wondering about is, I'm not sure about the sequencing of the writing of his book on Roberto Clemente versus your book, but did he influence you in writing this book by his just brilliant analysis of what Roberto Clemente went through as a man of color in an elite sport? Did you talk about, I mean, is there a relationship between his book and your book?
I wouldn't say that there's a relationship between specific books, but so my dad his name's David Maraniss. He is a much more accomplished author than I am. He's written, I think, 13 or 14 books. He's won a couple Pulitzers, so I cannot compete in terms of writing in my own dinner table.
You're still young though.
But I think that his biggest influence on me as a writer was just like a lifelong influence. Like as a kid, I was reading the Washington Post, like front page. Probably not a lot of kids did that, but it was my dad's article or his friends that were coming to our house. It was their stories, so I felt like a connection to a good newspaper from an early age. Again, he has always sort of been interested in teaching lessons on race. Like he would teach me root against the Red Sox because they were the last team to integrate,
Yeah.
things like that. So that was a part of my upbringing. And then I learned everything about writing by just reading his work. He didn't start writing books until after I graduated from college. So I wasn't necessarily reading his books. I was reading his articles. His first book came out in, I think, 93 or 94. It was a biography of Bill Clinton. But I would say that just his overall sensibilities and his writing style kind of seeped into me through osmosis. When I was actually writing the book, I would send chapters back, printed out chapters to my parents just for them to read as I was working on it. And I would get a package back in the mail with edits from my mom, who's a great editor. She reads his stuff too, but not from him, and as much as I appreciated what my mom was telling me, I was like, you're married to someone who's written a lot of books. Like, it would really be helpful to hear from him too. And I never did. And I was getting frustrated. My dad and I have joked about this, but I think his reasoning was especially because it was my first book, that I would have a sense that I really did it without his fingerprints all over it.
Awesome.
And so I was grateful for that in the end.
Sure. Yeah. Interesting. I also wanted to go back to something I mentioned during the lead-in, this theme of leadership. That's something that I'm just very interested in. Perry Wallace became a leader, and I observed that he went to all the major events he observed what was happening around him in civil rights and so forth. But the part that really grabbed me and made me start thinking of this was you're talking about Arthur Ashe, Bill Russell, and Muhammad Ali. Kiva will tell you that I often talk about Muhammad Ali, and Muhammad Ali was in my family. My sons call me the greatest because I make them call me the greatest because of Muhammad Ali, not because I'm the greatest, but because that was something that started really early. So that's just a personal reason why it grabbed me. But the different leadership styles that those three elite athletes, elite citizens, I'll say, beyond athletic, they transcended athletics, as did Perry. Could you talk about that and how it influenced him and how he became a leadership? And there are other leadership aspects as well, particularly Chancellor Hurd leadership and Chaplain Asbury and his friend that you mentioned earlier, who was really a born politician. He exercised it. So just talk a little bit about the leadership theme there.
Yeah, it's an interesting point that you brought up. I mean, it's not like necessarily, there's so many books that executives and business people read on leadership. And this isn't one of those types of books, but I do think that it does sort of express a lot of leadership lessons, leadership styles. You mentioned a lot of names. So Alexander Hurd was the chancellor at Vanderbilt, who was brought in to really open up the university in the 60s to become a more progressive place. And the stroke of leadership that he showed was he knew part of that was changing things on the campus, but part of that was also changing perception of the university around the country. And he knew that for better or worse, people paid a lot of attention to sports. And so he thought that one way he could change the perception of Vanderbilt was by desegregating the SEC at Vanderbilt. And so he called the coach into his office and said, we have Black undergraduates now, so you can recruit a Black player. And in fact, I would like you to, and he put that out there that I would like you to. And the coach took him up on it, which that same conversation was happening at the University of Kentucky, and Adolph Rupp really resisted it. But Roy Skinner, the coach at Vanderbilt, embraced it. Skinner leadership. He was a decent enough man that he recruited Perry and wanted him on his team, but didn't really understand what was necessary as Perry's coach to support him. And his attitude was the best thing he could do for Perry was to treat him like anybody else on the team. And that meant like no extra special conversations or anything like that. But Perry wasn't being treated like anyone else on the team, when teams weren't canceling games against Vanderbilt because some white guy was on the team, or the fans weren't threatening to kill other players on the team. And so he was missing an aspect of leadership in terms of his empathy and understanding of how he could support this player that was dealing with other things that other guys weren't. The other contemporaries of Perry's in the 60s, when he was a student at Vanderbilt, Martin Luther King and Stokely Carmichael came to speak on campus, both of whom sort of represented different leadership styles in terms of how to address civil rights in the United States. King was considered too conservative by many of Perry's Black classmates at the time, who were drawn to Carmichael's more outspoken rhetoric. People like Arthur Ashe, who handled things in a way that to some was considered conservative or accommodating, right? As opposed to Ali, who spoke his mind 100% at any time. And Bill Russell, who was in some ways a pioneer like Perry. And Perry said that Boston was the most difficult city he ever visited. And this is a guy that played in Starkville, Mississippi in the 1960s. Mm-hmm. So he really admired what Russell was going through, and Russell was writing about it, at the time, and trying to educate people. And so Perry, I think, absorbed a little bit of all of those leadership styles and sensibilities, approaches to trying to change things. Some of Perry's classmates at Vanderbilt his Black classmates considered him too much of an insider, trying to change things from the inside. Perry would say, well, you might be out there being loud, but what are you actually getting done? So they were having those types of discussions. Some of his Black classmates from high school called him a sellout or Uncle Tom for even going to Vanderbilt, in their mind, he should have gone to an HBCU. And so he was on top of all the pressures that he was receiving from white classmates and professors, administrators at Vanderbilt. It wasn't always a comforting thing to go back to his own neighborhood. And so the pressures on him were more difficult than I think anybody could imagine at that time.
A prophet, the saying, a prophet is without honor in his own backyard, resonates with that. Like, you ought to, you get out and you want to come back and be, sometimes it's challenging when you do get out to come back to try to be yourself, because you'll face oppression and interracial discrimination is what you just described there, Andrew. Mm-hmm. And I think that, the whole thing about leadership is more than, like you said, he talks about this word equalizer, like how things were equalized by the teachers that he had experienced. And you talked about the Coach Skinner, was wanted to treat him equally when equitable distribution or equitable engagement needed to take place, because he was not equal by any means. He was not equal in race and on socioeconomic status, so he could not have been treated just, quote unquote, just like any other player. It needed to be an extra effort to engage him from an equitable standpoint, to make him feel welcome.
I think of that graphic that about the difference between equality and equity. Have you seen it where the kids are standing watching a baseball game?
I was just thinking of
that's
that.
right.
Yep.
Yeah.
I was just going to mention that. That's the point. And he interestingly, his approach on the court was a little, his approach, I would say, was different from off the court. He was he was very sensitive to not being too aggressive on the court, but realized, I almost got the impression he became a reluctant leader, but once he decided that he was going to be a leader on campus, then he was forceful about it.
Yeah, there was a transformation that took place over his career. You're right. I mean, we talked about how he was limited in this rule change about the dunk disappearing, but I think in some ways Perry would admit that he limited himself in certain ways too, because as a reaction to racism, if he hit a player in the face with an elbow, what was going to happen on the court with all the players, and what was the fan reaction going to be to that? And so he was conscious. I mean, how do you play your very best when all those things are on your mind?
Yeah, that's right.
And that's what he was having to deal with. Over the course of his career at Vanderbilt, he decided that in some cases he was very, very careful, right? Like, so after MLK was assassinated, there was a peaceful march that was going to take place in Nashville that Perry wanted to participate in. But he knew that as a basketball player and as this pioneering basketball player, he was going to be looked at with extra scrutiny no matter what he was doing, and that there were certain people on campus or around town that, that didn't like King, first of all, right? And wouldn't want Perry participating in this. And they would call it a hostile protest when really it was just a peaceful march about someone that had been murdered. And so Perry was always thinking several steps ahead, and he went down to the athletic department and explained what he was going to do and why he was going to do it. Being put in that position where he had to think several steps ahead just to do ordinary things, like honor Martin Luther King. By the end of his career, he was less concerned, I think, about what people thought, right? And just felt like, I'm just going to do it. This has to get done. And so the day after his last game, he gave an interview to the local paper where he outlined everything that he had been through for 4 years. And he told me that by giving that interview, he suspected he was writing his ticket out of town. And what he meant was, this is the town he had grown up in, where he had been valedictorian of his high school, 3-time state champion, all SEC basketball player, great student at Vandy engineering degree. And like all those things that add up to setting yourself up for success in your hometown after your playing days. But simply by telling the truth in this article, the Vanderbilt community, the white community in Nashville wasn't going to want to hear it, and that they would shoot the messenger, And so that's what happened after this article came out. People called him ungrateful. They said, good riddance, get out of town. But Perry said he had a moral obligation to tell the truth. And that was a special obligation for a pioneer, is that you have to talk about what your experience has been like for the benefit of the people who will come after you, but also for the benefit of the institution itself. And so Perry's thinking about this school and what's best for this university, even as it's not treated him well, And so what a big man it took to be thinking not only about the Black students that would come after him, but trying to improve the school. Just one of many, many reasons why Perry was such a remarkable person, and a reason why I was really happy that later in his life, and including parts of his life beyond when the book ends, that he ultimately did receive the respect and the love and the admiration from this community that had run him off. And so way Perry described that, as he said, reconciliation without the truth is just acting. And a lot of times a company or a school or a family.
That's a great quote.
Yeah, Perry was a real poet. And there's this temptation to put out the happy photo op, and say everything's great now. But have you really dealt with the truth of how you got in that situation in the first place? And if you haven't, it's just for show. It's just acting. Yeah. But if the truth is present, then reconciliation can be really powerful, and it can produce knowledge and change and healing. And he felt that because the way that people had changed at Vanderbilt, the way more Black people in positions of power at the university, a more diverse student body, white administrators and students who actually cared, that things had changed enough that he felt like it was a real reconciliation. And I was really happy about that for Perry's sake.
Yeah.
Yeah. I like that. I like that quote. It resonates with something that I teach when I do this DEI work, diversity, equity, inclusion work with agencies, is that we don't want you to be performative in nature. We want you to be progressive and working towards change, real meaningful change. And that quote resonates with that, it's easy to be performative and we're just doing this just because, but where's the real change? Where's the real meaningful change towards social justice? And I think that quote really hit, and it really tells about his sacrificial life, that he sacrificed himself in many ways to make sure that to get for Vanderbilt to be, an institution where it's more inclusive and integrative. So I just think that's a powerful quote. I really like it. And I wanted to touch in a little bit, because every time I read these type of books, something changes me on the inside, and I tend to grow and learn and about my own personal views and around this topic. I just want to ask you, what did you learn about yourself in writing this book, like about your own views and values on racism and social justice, as you went through this this 8-year-long period of research and knowing Mr. Wallace and learning about his experience? How did that impact you personally in terms of this topic on racism and social justice?
I think it had hopefully a profound impact on me. It was a life-changing experience to set aside writing the book, but just to spend that much time with a brilliant person like Perry, and every time I interviewed him, I just tried to be like his student, and just absorb as much as I could of what he had to teach me, not only about his own life, but Perry had a real ability to step outside of himself and look at the world in a bigger context, and even see how he was seen by other people, But I think significantly, like what it did is it taught me there's a difference between just thinking something and actually doing something, and it's not good enough to just believe that I tend to think the right things, quote unquote, but like that doesn't really do any good. You've got to act on it. And so when I talk to kids, and I adapted this book as a young reader's book for middle school students, and I always conclude with a slide that has the word upstander on it. And I talk about the difference between being an upstander and a bystander, and how important that was in Perry's life. When he was at Vanderbilt, he was surrounded by a lot of bystanders who were his teammates and classmates that saw, or at least should have seen, that their friend or their classmate, their teammate, was not being treated fairly, and yet they chose not to do anything. And they said, that's not my problem, that's his problem, and what a difference it would have made if there had been more upstanders in his life. And so I try to live that out now, and not just write a book about it, but that's why I've continued to write books that deal with sports and social issues, whether it's anti-Semitism or homophobia or sexism, and trying to teach these lessons through sports books aimed at teenagers, and get kids interested in reading through sports, but then also challenge them with these ideas about how we all treat each other using sports, which I think is an accessible way to do it. There might be a kid in a school who wouldn't ordinarily pick up a book about one of these topics, but they will pick up a book with the basketball player on the cover, or a baseball player on the cover. And so that's how it's changed me, is me thinking that's my way of trying to make the world better, is through telling these stories. Some people become politicians or social worker or work, in different ways on issues. And my way is by writing about them.
Wow.
Now that's a great segue, since you mentioned baseball, to Singled Out. And we're getting a little short on time, and I don't want to miss the opportunity. I love basketball too, but I really love baseball. Talk to us about that book. A different topic, but similar topic. How did that evolve? And tell us a little bit about the book.
Yeah, so Singled Out is my most recent book. It's a biography of Glenn Burke, who is an African-American baseball player for the Dodgers and the A's. He's considered the first openly gay Major League Baseball player. And as you mentioned at the beginning, he's the inventor of the high five. Also, he and Dusty Baker high-fived in the last game of the 1977 regular season, and the Dodgers coined the term. But that book is, it's about homophobia in sports. It's about how Glenn was really robbed of his career because of who he was, and the fact that he would not go along with a bribe that was offered by the Dodgers to cover up his sexuality. It's been a topical point of discussion here recently with some of the Dodgers finally honored Glenn at their Pride Night last week after decades of refusing to really acknowledge his existence. And then the Tampa Bay Rays, your son Tyler wrote an article about how they were wearing caps for their Pride Night with the rainbow logo. And some of the players refused to wear those caps. And so in some ways, you see some of the same issues that Glenn Burke was dealing with in the 1970s, still present in sports, in baseball in particular. But in other ways, things really have changed quite a bit too. We've seen a number of players come out in other sports. The fact that the Dodgers and the Rays and the A's and other teams are really promoting their pride activities in such visible ways is a huge sea change from the environment that Glenn was in, where the Dodgers felt like it would be a public relations disaster if their fans found out there was a gay player on the team, and they wouldn't tolerate that, and they shipped him off. So Glenn's story is inspiring in some ways. It's tragic in others. He was run out of the game, becomes homeless on the streets of San Francisco, and dies of AIDS. But he's a fascinating character. And as a baseball fan, it was a real thrill to interview his teammates like Dusty Baker and Mike Norris and Davey Lopes and others to work on this book that took place in the late 70s, which was really when I was sort of becoming conscious as a 7, 8, 9, 10-year-old kid about baseball.
When did he come out?
He actually officially came out in 1982. After his career. He went on the Today Show with Bryant Gumbel, and there was an article in Inside Sports magazine. But that was official for the public. His teammates knew. Going back to his minor league days. Dusty knew when he was called up with the Dodgers. And yet, some people would then and now would call a gay player in the locker room like a quote unquote distraction, that would create a distraction. The real distraction on the Dodgers at that time was Lasorda himself, who was inviting Don Rickles and Frank Sinatra and all these celebrities into the locker room before games. Glenn, on the other hand, was the most popular player on the team. Dusty said he kept things loose and light. They loved his attitude. And when he was traded, Don Sutton and Steve Garvey were seen at their lockers crying over the fact that this rookie fourth outfielder was traded, and that shows what charisma and presence Glenn had on that team and how much he was loved by his teammates.
Yeah, I'm wondering whether it was like soldiers would say, if I'm in the foxhole with you and you're fighting with me, I don't care.
Yeah, I think there was.
I just don't care. Is that the way the players felt?
I think so. That they felt like they respected his heart and his hustle, his playing ability, and just the way his personality. And so, they didn't really care the way that the management of the team did. There was a real distinction between the way he was treated by his teammates and by management.
Interesting. Wow. Well, there's another one I've got to read. Well, I guess it's unfortunately it's about time to wrap this up. I always like to ask this question. So, other than Perry Wallace, who is your role model in the area of race relations? Yeah,
there's a couple of authors that I really admire. I would say Caste by Isabel Wilkerson is one of the best books I've ever read on race. Living here in Nashville, I've had a chance to go down to Montgomery, Alabama, to the Equal Justice Initiative Museum. Brian Stevenson, you may know Just Mercy, his book and the movie based on that. So those are two people. And then also here at Vanderbilt, I'm really fortunate to work for Candace Lee, who is the first Black woman athletic director in the Southeastern Conference. And so I'm around her every day, and
nice.
And feel really fortunate that that's the case. There were two other older figures that were, I think, influential on me. One was Ed Martin, who was a former Negro League baseball player who became a basketball coach at Tennessee State and then a professor at Vanderbilt. When I was a young person just out of school, he would come by and just sit in the office and tell stories, and it was kind of like listening to Perry, but I was hearing stories from someone a generation even older than Perry, and then there was a man named Butch McCord, who was another former Negro League baseball player who lived in Nashville and just died maybe 5 or 10 years ago. But he would, again, he had stories to tell and I wanted to hear him, and so I would go over to his house and he would tell me what it was like playing with Cool Papa Bell, or
Sure, wow.
other names that you read about. And I think that's just been the thing for me is listening. I'll throw out one more. It was Buck O'Neil. When I worked for the Tampa Bay Rays, I had a chance to meet him twice. Once in spring training in Sarasota, we played the Reds, and I talked to him on the field there. And then in Kansas City, when the Rays played the Royals, I had lunch with him before a game.
Wow.
And I just think it's really important to seek out those older people with stories to tell and soak up as much knowledge as you can, but then recognize that these issues, which sometimes, talk about civil rights movement as if it's only in the past. Yeah. When that's, of course, so not true. Like it's not only in the past, we're living through a lot of the same battles right now, or they seem to be getting so much worse. And so that's why I think that, staying up to date on these contemporary authors is important. And then just day-to-day interactions with Black people that are part of my life every day.
Awesome.
Kiva, do you want to tell Andrew why we smiled when he said cast?
Yeah, so John and I, we just have a really, really great relationship, and I so appreciate and honor him for his willingness and your willingness too, Andrew, just to sit and listen and engage and talk and learn from each other. And so we had decided that to read Cast together. And so we read Cast together and we got 1,000 notes. And so we're going to do a special edition to the Race to Justice, Social Justice podcast. Actually, we'll be recording that tomorrow.
And
it's a live. Yeah, it's going to be recorded live, not virtually. We'll have a nice sit down and just go back and forth on what we've learned and how Isabel Wilkinson's book has transformed us as individuals and also our knowledge and great appreciation of the struggles and the history around. Because I just feel like the more we keep sweeping history under the carpet, and I know, that's what certain members of society want us to do, is like forget about what happened. We just can't, because it's resonating today. And so it's hard to do that when we have so many atrocities that continue to be displayed every single day. I'm on a 21-day media news fast, and I haven't watched the news. I haven't, friends sending me, Instagrams on this and that. Did you hear this? I've been on a 21-day fast of all social media and news platforms because I just want to. Well, I'm really preparing for a public speaking gig on Friday, and I want my mental state to be solid. And at the same time, I'm analyzing. I'm doing a self-analysis. Do I have, as a result of this 21 days, how do I feel psychologically? Has my psychological, because there's a lot weighing on you when you watch breaking news and you see all these different things happening. My sense of hope sometimes can wane when these things happen. So I wanted to end with my question for you, Andrew, is in terms of hope. Are you hopeful in light of, all the problems faced in achieving social and racial justice in our society today, particularly, with the heightened current events that have occurred over the past, 30 to 60 days? What's your sense of hope around all of this?
Yeah. To be 100% honest, there's a lot of times where I'm not that hopeful, and not just related to race, but just about politics, democracy, gun violence, all that. And having 2 kids, I worry about the world that they're growing up in, and I get pretty down about it a lot and discouraged. But I don't want to be that way, And so then what keeps me hopeful is thinking about people like Perry, who were living in a world that was in many ways a lot worse, right? And
Yeah.
facing challenges that were a lot more daunting. And he didn't give up,
Yeah.
And I think that Perry would talk about faith and the idea that, you're working towards something. There's no promise that anything great is going to happen or that what you're working for will come true, but that belief that it might, and so I try to keep that attitude that I think that Perry would have had. And he would also say in just a very realistic way, what's the alternative?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like why would you act like there isn't hope? What are you going to do? Right. So keep working,
That's right.
And so I think that your podcast that you have is a great example of being hopeful, and having these conversations to, not only influence each other, but everybody who listens, and I think that at its simplest form, it's changing people, right? And maybe it's one person at a time. Sometimes I think Perry had a realistic attitude about this. He would say that you can't expect everybody to be a superhero. Not everybody's going to be the first person in line at every march, Not everyone's going to get involved on every single issue, but you can hope to bring people along from where they are at the moment to somewhere better, in the future. And so accept people where they are, but hope and work with them to move along. And I think if you have that sort of bite-sized view, you can overcome this grander maybe loss of hope and work on things at a smaller level. Keeps you hopeful.
Wow. That's awesome.
Good.
I think that's a great place to land the plane. What do you think, John?
Yeah, I do too. Thank you very much,
Awesome.
Andrew. This has been terrific. Just terrific.
Yeah, this has been a lot of fun for me too. Thank you so much for the invitation.
I'm glad. And I don't know when I'm going to get down to Nashville again, but I had a lot of trips down to Nashville, not just when Tyler was in college. I love the place.
All right. Yeah,
I still have 2 Bluebird Cafe shirts that I wear for workout shirts,
Awesome.
Well, I'll be up in Philadelphia this summer. One of the goals for my family, which is a very self-serving goal, but the kids, they have bought into it, is that we want to take them to every Major League Baseball stadium before they are out of the house.
Oh, wow.
As a family.
Awesome.
And so this summer, we're going to Baltimore, both New York teams and the Phillies game. So
wow.
I'll be up there
in late
July.
Game yet? Do you know which
Y'all
game?
be on the East Coast tour.
Yeah, it'll be the East Coast tour. I don't remember it off the top of my head. John,
let me know.
Let me know.
Let me know. If I'm around, I'll be there.
That'd be great. That'd be great.
Awesome.
Good.
Awesome. Well, great. Well, thank you all for listening to another Race to Social Justice podcast. Thank you all for watching on our YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We really appreciate that, for following us. And please join us again for another courageous conversation on our Race to Social Justice. We'd like to thank our guest, Mr. Andrew Maraniss, for his insight and just his powerful contributions to social justice and being an author of several books. And get the book, Strong Inside, great read. And we appreciate you. We look to see you again as we continue this race to social justice. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you.
The Race to Social Justice podcast is produced, edited, and mixed at The Dream in Austin, Texas. Visit thedreamrecordingstudio.com for more info.